Good evening to you all, and welcome, and a really big special welcome to our speaker, Neera. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here to give a Darwin Castle lecture on the theme of democracy and revolutionary politics, the theme of our latest book. Neera was a former professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of New Delhi, and is currently a visiting professor at the JNU, also in New Delhi. She's taught political theory, comparative politics, and has written and widely published on a very substantial range of subjects. Here are some: civil society, secularism, democracy, affirmative action, representation, social and economic rights, and on freedom from poverty as a human right. She's had a huge influence on political ideas in India and way beyond the Indian continent. Neera is the author of a number of books. I'll just mention three apart from this book, which has just come out: The State and Civil Society, which was published in 1995, Beyond Secularism, The Rights of Religious Minorities, published in 1999, and The Conceits of Civil Society, published in 2003. We are really pleased to have you here this evening.
Thank you.
And please join me in giving her a very warm welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Good evening. I'm enormously honored to be invited to give this be part of this very prestigious lecture series. I mean, when I looked at the list of speakers who preceded me and who will no doubt come after me, I had what can be called approximately a panic attack. I mean, all these people and me, what do I have to say? So if I have nothing to say, hopefully you will still think that I have said something. I don't know. So thank you for inviting me here, and thank you for being here. What is it that we do when we do political theory? This is a question I think most political theorists have asked themselves. But I'm talking about normative political theory, what can be called closely approximates political philosophy. John Donne tells us that the task of a political theorist is to identify political predicaments and show us best how to resolve them, which is no doubt a very worthwhile ambition for political theorists, because the task of political theory is to address concrete political issues. However, when it comes to resolving them, I must confess I have some skepticism towards the thought. Because if political theory is addressing politics, politics is notoriously chancy and contingent and plain messy. It's contradictory. The same sort of politics can give us completely different outcomes. We don't know what to make of this politics. Then the tasks of political theorists to categorize these phenomena into neat, observable categories that can be easily understood by students may prevent understanding of how untidy our political life is likely to be or is. In fact, what politics gives us is dilemmas. A dilemma occurs, and dilemma is by its nature irresolvable. A dilemma occurs when our commitment to objective X conflicts with our commitment to objective Y. And I want to quote a little anecdote from one of our epics in India, Mahabharata, to illustrate the point. There was a hermit called Kausika who had vowed to tell the truth, always tell the truth, because he wanted to go to heaven. He was standing by the roadside, by a crossroads, and he found a group of travelers rushing, and then he saw they were being pursued by bandits. The bandits, no doubt knowing his reputation for always telling the truth, asked him which way the travelers had gone, and he pointed. He didn't go to heaven. Now, Bimal Matilal, the philosopher, the noted philosopher of Indian philosophy as well as Kantian philosophy, says You see, the problem is that Indian philosophy sets great store, like Kant did, on telling the truth. You must always tell the truth. But when you have a choice between telling the truth and saving innocent lives, how are you going to resolve the dilemma? Yes, it is one of those irreconcilable paradoxes. Now, Matilal suggests that this man who caused the death, with all good intentions, of innocent people, of innocent travelers, could have been more innovative. He could have kept quiet when he was asked which way have the travelers gone. He could have said, I know, but I will not tell you. But he insisted on telling the truth. He chose his commitment unreflectively, unimaginatively, and therefore innocent lives were lost. So this sort of dilemma means when you're faced with a dilemma in political life, you have to be imaginative, you have to be innovative. You cannot say one is wrong, the other is right. Perhaps, perchance, both are correct. Consider the relationship between democracy and violence. Now, we are political theorists would tell us, historians would tell us, democracy is the best form of government because it encourages dialogue, it encourages communicative action, it encourages dissent. And yet, so violence should be completely unknown to it. They should be strangers in the night. But they are not, because in country after country, we see democracies being rocked by violence. And I'm not talking of terrorism, because I think that demands a separate kind of an argument. I'm talking about the violence that citizens wreak upon their own people and upon government in pursuit of a number of objectives. To get certain benefits, to pressurize the government as a form of dissent. Now, all these forms of violent protest reiterate the legitimacy of a government that can give benefits. Very often, the group that demands through violent means certain objectives demands it for its own group. It may be a professional group, it may be an ethnic group. But you have a different kind of violence, revolutionary violence, where revolutionaries deny political legitimacy but affirm moral legitimacy to their fellow citizens, particularly the most deprived, the most impoverished, the most poverty-stricken. India is a democracy, and yet the country, the central part of the country, which is called the tribal heartland, is run over by what is known popularly as Maoists, the Maoist phenomena. The former Prime Minister of India said they were the greatest threat to India's security. Now, it's easy to say democracy is a good and violence is a bad. I am not bringing in the whole notion into this argument that violence is a bad. Of course, violence is a bad. You don't have to say it. But allowing people to live in conditions that can be best described as triple disadvantaged, where they suffer from economic deprivation, social discrimination, and lack of voice, is also a bad. So if these people pick up the gun or support those who are picking up the gun, armed revolutionaries of Maoist cadres, would you blame them the way you would blame somebody who goes shooting at innocent school children? So before saying this is good, this is bad, we would need to map out the dilemmas, and this is what I hope to do in this presentation. So my paper will necessarily be incomplete. What I wish to do is to map out dilemmas and say, look, how do we choose? Politics is replete with dilemmas. The Maoists are fighting a war to secure a society each egalitarian would dream of. Which egalitarian Democrat does not want to see a society where little babies do not die of avoidable hunger? So, in a way, one is forced to accept that people are using violence as a politics of the last resort. They haven't been heard, they lack voice. And B, that means the objectives are good. You would love to see a society with these kinds of objectives. On the other hand, if you think deeply on the issue, I mean, one can be committed to armed revolutionary struggle by saying the state is illegitimate, it is imperfectly democratic, it wreaks violence upon its own people, the state should go. And yet we have to examine the other implications of this form of politics. If the first dilemma is between democracy and violence, the second dilemma is what exactly is political violence is about. When I talk about political violence in this context, I mean revolutionary violence. Revolutionary violence is a form of politics that may well be waged for the right reasons, and prima facie, it can be defended. If people have nothing else, no other way of being heard, perhaps picking up the gun is one way of being heard. But the costs attached to political violence are very high. There is nothing that is noble about violence. Each new morn, says Macduff in Shakespeare's Macbeth, new widows howl, new orphans cry, new sorrows strike heaven in the face that it resounds. Our collective lives are deeply impacted by violence, which fetches, of course, state violence. The paradox is that this form of politics, even if it's waged for the right reasons, even if it is waged in context that makes sense to us, need not add up to political prudence or to political wisdom. It's bad politics to wave away losses of human life and destruction of habitats as collateral damage and focus on the goal instead. The problem is we don't know if the goal ever will be achieved. History has shown us. Historians have told us, historians of revolution, that revolutions have a way of devouring their own children. We cannot ever be confident that the objectives for which the guerrillas have picked up arms will ever be achieved. In any case, we don't know whether it will come about. None of us can predict what the future is going to be, because contingency and fortune, in Machiavelli's sense, is the name of the game we call politics. So how do we judge violence? And we have to evaluate political violence because it is a form of politics, and we have to evaluate politics. No form of politics can be its own judge, jury, and defendant. Politics has to be evaluated. Every form of politics. How do you evaluate politics? Normally, politics is evaluated by its objectives, by its strategies, by its conventions, by its goals, by the way it seeks to mobilize people. My suggestion is that revolutionary politics should be weighed, should be evaluated according to its own presuppositions. What exactly does revolutionary politics seek to do? What does it seek to do? Does this particular mode of politics allow people who have been triply disadvantaged to stand up and speak back to history that is not of their making? Do they allow people, do they enable people to acquire agency? Can these people who have been disadvantaged become actors in their own right? Can they participate in the multiple transactions of a society from a position of equality? In a society that is stamped by inequality and oppression, democratic politics is about transitions. These transitions don't happen. We all know what our political parties are incapable of, let alone capable of. Politics has to be judged on what it does for people who have been triply disadvantaged. Now, field research tells us that in those areas of India which are called the Red Corridor, One thing that the Maoists have accomplished is to enable people to stand up and speak back to history, have actually allowed people to straighten their backs and speak back to upper caste, propertied men. These arguments that irrespective of the fact that a social and an economic transformation may not be on the anvil, there are some chances that agency will be restored to people. These arguments, of course, famously echo the ones made in The Wretched of the Earth by the Algerian Frantz Fanon during the Algerian struggle. He was not strictly an Algerian, but certainly an honorary one. His Wretched of the Earth, which was published posthumously, is till today seen as a classic on political violence. He worked out the intricacies on violence, the way it produces and reproduces itself, and he told us the colors of violence do not wash out quite that easily. Fanon is normally known as an advocate of violence, as a theorist of violence. And it is true that he says that if the oppressed, and Algeria, if you remember, had lost its identity during French colonialism as a country, it had become a department of the French government. And that was what the Algerian War of Independence was about. The violence of settler colonialism had hammered the Algerian people into submission. And Fanon said, logically, the only way the native can speak back to history that has enslaved his mind and his body is to use the weapon of the colonized against him, pick up the gun, acquire agency, and as a psychiatrist, he was a psychiatrist, obviously, recover manhood. But if you look at one particular chapter in the famous Wretched of the Earth, rightfully quite famous, he says very clearly, hatred of the colonizer is what causes this rush of blood. And I meet him as an equal because I meet his equal as I meet his violence with my violence. Is that the end of the story? Hatred, says Fanon, can never be an agenda, just one temporary and disposable milestone on the road to liberation. The uses of violence have to be constantly patrolled. The use of violence has to be subordinated to a political project. He says, that two things are going to happen if you do not subordinate violence to a political project. The first thing that is going to happen is the moment the colonizer recognizes the native, that's his words, that is the word he uses, as an equal, the Algerian will put down the gun. That is his aspiration, his desire, and the revolution will be over. Secondly, the moment ordinary people are fighting the colonizer, there's a new post-colonial class that is emerging that is also going to practice violence upon the people. His theory, we see, is much more nuanced. Violence has to be it has to be yoked to a political project, and politics has to concentrate on enabling agency, has to enable people to acquire agency as actors who can speak back to history, who can make their history. They may make their history in ways they do not want to. Marx had said that human beings make history, but not in conditions of their own choice. But that's not the idea. People should be in a position, and if that is needed, that is the aim of politics. Because whatever you get to people in terms of social and economic remuneration, you may have a welfare state. Yes, and I'm speaking in a country that is known for once being a welfare state. Yes, that is not enough. But what is symptomatic of democracy is equality. And if democracy cannot exist with justice, I beg your pardon, if democracy exists with injustice, then something wrong in that democracy, and justice is when people participate in the multiple transactions of a society as equals, not as unequal. You cannot have political inequality and social and economic inequality because that impacts upon the ability of people to become agents. We have to learn from Fanon when we set out to evaluate revolutionary violence. At an earlier time and an earlier place, Mao Zedong, the architect of China's revolution against semi-feudalism and semi-imperialism, had said much the same thing. He had, it is well known that Mao completely overturns Marxist theory of revolution on its head. Marx had said, revolution will come to advanced industrialized societies, and Mao said, revolution will happen in agrarian countries with feudal elites, and it will come through violence. Notably, guerrilla war is not specific to Maoism. In the immortal classic War and Peace, Leo Tolstoy evocatively and powerfully describes how the segments of the Russian army were harassed by civilian forces. The Russian army was going back to France. I'm so sorry. Napoleon's army was going back to France after seeing that Moscow, that they wanted to dominate, had been burnt to the ground. And how groups of Russians harassed them, waging guerrilla war. They only had one objective, that the French army does not come back to Russia. Guerrilla techniques of warfare have been employed against invaders, against colonial powers, against autocratic regimes, and sometimes against democratic regimes as well. In the middle of the 20th century, another model of revolutionary warfare was given to us by the famous Che Guevara. Born in village Rosario in Argentina in 1928, Guevara, who is now known best for his face, which was imprinted on T-shirts worn with designer jeans, gained immense fame as a theoretician, as a tactician of guerrilla war. And he came to a conclusion that the only way Latin America could be redeemed was through war. And he was a very active participant in the Cuban Revolution. The Cuban Revolution, he said, in tandem with Mao, had to be waged from the countryside, and it had to use violence, even if conditions were not necessary. Now, what Che did was to completely reverse Marx's dictum that in order to have a revolution, objective conditions must be necessary, and you must have the primacy of politics. Che, on the other hand, dispenses with objective conditions and talks about the primacy of politics and says the guerrilla must go start off violence, the police and the state will react, and ordinary peasants will be radicalized. Now you see in Che, much as we admire him, not an iota of interest in that people for whom they are fighting and who are going to bear the costs of state violence, how they should be inserted into history, how they have to be part of this history that is being waged. And it's interesting. In Maoism, there is a guerrilla army, but there's also a communist party. For Che, a guerrilla army had to be its communist party, with the result that people, the peasants, were not politicized. This shows, I would suggest, some degree of contempt for people, for ordinary. This is not a people's war. This is a war being waged by guerrillas in favor of certain objectives. Till today, Che is admired, but he's also much attacked by communists because he obliterated the distinction between the need for a political force and an armed force. The two have to be different. They have to work together, but the political aspect of the war has to be about politicization of consciousness. How do you expect people to give you sanctuary or pick up the gun unless you tell them what the war is about? Unless you give them a coherent narrative, how things are, why they are, and how they can be. But Che Guevara writes in his diary, a short while before he died, according to Chalian, not a single peasant joined his revolution. Contrast this with the People's War, which was waged by someone who we have cause to admire, called Amilcar Cabral. In the small little West African country called Guinea-Bissau. Amilcar Cabral, who came from Cape Verde, which was also a part of Guinea-Bissau under Portuguese colonialism. And Portuguese colonialism has been characterized by Perry Anderson many, many years ago in the 1970s as ultra-colonialism. How could Portugal be a sophisticated colonial power And I think he was talking of Britain as being a sophisticated colonial power, when it itself was a colony of Great Britain. All that it was doing, economic colony, all it was doing was to give wine to Britain. The struggle in Guinea-Bissau against a power that actually dropped napalm bombs on the year in Mozambique, in Angola, and in Guinea-Bissau, on the year the United Nations declares the right of colonized people to self-determination, 1960. And if you drop napalm bombs, the area is completely wiped out. You can't grow anything on those lands. These are agricultural, agrarian societies. The struggle was inspired by one of the most extraordinary thinkers, I think, the world has known, Cabral. He comes to an impoverished country. He's an agronomist working with the United Nations. It's a poor country. This country, he says, needs a revolution. Where do you get its vanguard from? They don't have a working class. And the peasantry is the most subordinated, but the peasantry doesn't have the conscience, doesn't have the political consciousness. What he did was to perform, after Mao, another U-turn in Marxist theory of history and of revolution. Marx had characterized the lumpen proletariat, or the urban proletariat, as a lumpen class. It's not revolutionary significant. It's not going to form part of any kind of revolution. Guinea-Bissau, however, only had a lumpen proletariat. They had dock workers, they had sex workers, they had migrants. Cabral worked on them. He brought them together into a training school. He was not the first person who did it, because he does this around the end of the 1950s and the early 1960s. At the same time in Algeria, the urban lumpen proletariat is being transformed into a transformative guerrilla revolutionary force. 1966, Giles Pontecorvo's Battle of Algiers, Battle for Algiers, that wonderfully shows how women who were characterized as sex workers would carry bombs in their handbags. Urban guerrilla war was the USP of the Algerian struggle for independence. He said, Cabral says, that this class, composed randomly of beggars, dock workers, unemployed youth, sex workers, and other marginal sectors of society, are déclassés. They're outside the class structure. But these are our only resource. He opened the school, he trains them, and they start revolutionizing the peasantry, and war breaks out in the 1960s on the backs of highly politicized peasantry. The Portuguese army comes in. Portugal is a member of NATO. It has all the weapons provided by NATO, and the commander-in-chief said, these are poor, ignorant, we will wipe them out. By the beginning of the 1970s, he said, my forces have reached the edge of neurophysical exhaustion, because that is guerrilla war, when you harass the enemy when it least expected, and you withdraw when it launches an onslaught. More importantly, it politicized the peasantry. On the other hand, it opened up liberated zones, the party, PAIGC, Party Liberation of Guinea-Bissau, and Cape Verde. They open alternative structures like Vietnam did, where they participate in democratic institutions and practices, gender equality, new revolutions in education, and established organizations to disperse health and education and replace the commodification of agriculture by the barter system. So you have to show to your peasant, whom you expect to bear the burden of this revolutionary struggle, what things can be in Vietnam, in China, and in Guinea-Bissau. You create liberated zones with a very different logic, the logic of non-commodification. Through these processes, the party nurtures a very close connection between the guerrilla and the peasantry. This strategy of building up solidarity, of building up political consciousness, actually leads to a revolution in Lisbon, and the government is overthrown, and Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique, Angola get independent. The political visionary Amilcar Cabral was assassinated in 1973, about 8 months before the Declaration of Independence. But what he had done would have proved the impossible. Two models of guerrilla war are therefore on hand. The first model is prevalent in South America. Here, the model of warfare is called the Foucault theory, which focuses on violence but not on politics. And the other is the Maoist dictum of violence as a handmaiden to politics, the notion of people's war. The decisive factor in armed struggle, Mao had theorized, are not weapons, but people who are convinced of the rightness of a cause. And the guerrilla has to make these people his own for two reasons. One, the guerrillas need sanctuaries. And two, people have to be convinced when they fight, what is it that they're fighting for? What is that they're fighting against? Political mobilization is essential because whereas violence may help recover agency, reliance on violence alone can prove deceptive. The long forked tongue of violence poisons everything from the psyche of the colonized to the psyche of the colonizer. It possesses an uncanny ability to reproduce itself in the form of the colonized today, in the form of the post-colonial elite tomorrow. In order to prove genuinely liberating, this form of politics, armed warfare, has to be yoked to a new form of politics. Political mobilization has to precede actual fighting. In short, violence has to be controlled, it has to be subordinated, otherwise it can go haywire. How do we then look at Maoists in India? It is not as if the people among whom the Maoists came to work lacked political consciousness. Peasant revolts and tribal revolts have been a part of the history of India. What the Maoists have done is to give to them an integrated theory and revolts against oppression into a broader vision that is ideologically informed and historically grounded. This is an essential part of political mobilization. But when it comes to the question of whether the Maoists have followed the script authored by Mao, who I assume is their Talmud and their Bible, Mao Zedong's fought his guerrilla war, by and large, we run into a raging controversy with most observers saying that these guys are fighting a military war, they're not fighting a political war. They're not fighting a political war because of the context, and this gives us the first insight into violence. Any inquiry into violence can only be contextual. We cannot defend violence the way we would defend the right to dissent or to free speech or even to civil disobedience. Violence can only be defined and it can only be defended contextually within a particular context. In our case, the context is that of triple disadvantage. But when the context is a formal democracy, and here we run across another dilemma, the class project has worked very well when it has been aligned to a nationalist project. I personally am not I do not favor nationalism, but we cannot deny the power of nationalism on the collective psyche of people, and a number of historians have told us that the more people joined Mao's guerrilla army when they were fighting the Japanese than when they were fighting their own elites. In colonial countries, and Cabral was very clear about it, our main enemy is the colonizer, but we also have to sort out our own contradictions. In everywhere you see across the global south, what is now the global south, which was then the colonized world, you had the nationalist project being very much the defining feature of the class project. In the post-colonial world, I cannot think of a single instance where you have an armed struggle except in the noble cause of territorial self-determination. Where has there been an armed war in the pursuit of a class project? We cannot find it, because in a country which is a formal democracy, you have a form of seduction, of political seduction, that only democracy can give us, even though it is aligned to injustice. The people among whom the Maoists have gone to work are people who are torn, on the one hand, between the very persuasive rhetoric of Maoism, and on the other hand, by the seductions of elections, of choosing your own representative. In other words, the guerrilla armies have moved into deeply divided villages. Each village is earmarked by complex pecking orders, competing structures of loyalty to the leader of that or this political party, feuds large and small, with each person using the guerrilla as much as the guerrilla would use him to score off points. If the Maoists have underestimated the power of democracy, and that is what should worry political theorists, how well democracy can live with injustice. And is there a relationship between democracy and justice at all? Or is it contingent? Do we have to secure justice out of the recalcitrant hands of those who control our democratic polity through social action, through collective action? Or do you need the gun to pick up the gun in order to do so? There doesn't seem to be, on prima facie grounds, any relationship between democracy and justice. The two seem to be very different sort of normative orders, which may not come together unless they are linked through collective action. Now, one of these collective actions is armed force, where injustice is overwhelmed, when it is compounded by triple disprivilege. The problem is when you concentrate only on fighting and you concentrate less on politicization, because on the one hand you have elections, on the other hand you have the great army, the security forces. Without politics income, then, so the guerrillas are too busy fortifying their own defenses. They're too busy fighting a rearguard action. The problem is that without politics in command, violence goes berserk. It can best be likened to a quagmire that relentlessly sucks people into its murky depths, and from here there is no escape. When violence holds individuals and groups in thrall, moral disintegration follows. For we cannot control violence, violence controls us. Fanon had told us long ago that when the colonial finger writes the alphabet of power in blood and gore, the script is ineffaceable and the imprint it leaves on the body politic is indelible. Violence leaves stigmata. Much as the murder of Duncan left blood on Lady Macbeth's hands, what will these hands never be clean? She asks repeatedly. How can then a new society, free of oppression and exploitation, be created? All we have on our hands is a blood-stained history, not a political history that can show us a way out of our highly exploitative society. Political violence without political mobilization, for all its seeming heroism and devilry, is actually a lazy way of doing politics. It is executed by a handful of cadres, and it eschews transformation of the body politic or its members. Violence as spectacle reduces people to being mere audiences or bystanders. In the process, nothing can ever change, perhaps nothing will. In sum, we have to be aware of the indeterminacy and of the unpredictability of this form of politics and the incapacity of human beings to control violence, or rather the relentless impulse of violence to control those who handle it for definable ends. This is the study of the tricky parts of violence. To conclude, we are faced with a very big moral dilemma today, a very big political dilemma, and there seems to be no way of reconciling these very antagonistic parts. The first antagonism is between democracy and injustice. Logically, they should be Siamese twins, or perhaps democracy should be built into justice should be built into democracy. But we see repeatedly in country after country, including the West, formal democracy coexists very happily with injustice. When after decades, people who suffer from threefold injustice pick up the gun, maybe people who are committed to a more egalitarian democracy might understand them, might applaud them, and may even follow them, because the goal of revolutionary violence is not to extract benefits for one group and one group alone. The goal of revolutionary violence is to transform society, and as I said earlier, which egalitarian would not like to see society transformed in the image that egalitarians dream of? The problem is this mode of politics doesn't make for good politics. Not in a democracy. It doesn't make for good politics because in country after country, it is competing with rival ideologies for people's minds and collective psyches. And if all that is being done is to give away a piece of land there or to make property holders out of the dispossessed, you're not going to create a transformative society. In the original home of Maoism in India, in West Bengal, in a village called Naxalbari, today, those who were initially in the struggle in the 70s are property holders. Their capacity to wage a political battle against dispossession, against injustice, against lack of democracy has been neutralized by the state. So if violence has to be used, it has to be yoked to a political project. This Mao told us, this Fanon told us, this Cabral told us. But if only violence is going to be used, if only force is going to be used, then you're going to actually depoliticize people. And this is a dilemma that it's very hard to make sense of. So on the one hand, you're faced by considerable injustice. A political theorist might well say there's no way out except violence. On the other hand, you might say, violence for what? For reproducing the same order, for corrupting mentalities and corrupting people. This is the dilemma which actually the lack of a relationship between democracy and injustice presents before us. I leave it open at this moment. Maybe we'd be able to talk more about it in the discussion. Thank you.
Asking some very tough questions about very difficult issues. Extremely difficult issues, but the fact that these issues are pressing is not, of course, just of historic interest. If we think of Hamas or Hezbollah or any number of military groups around the world who are waging battles around political symbols, we can see that these questions are of deep-rooted and contemporary significance. And I very much hope everyone in this room will join this discussion now, as many of you as possible. So, questions, please. Perhaps everyone can say who they are when they ask a question.
I'm starting. Okay, I'm Beth Khan. I work in the School of Government. I just wanted to ask, I think you're definitely onto something with this idea of the needing of a political project, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what sort of political project is required and why. And I wonder if it was to do with worries about stability in the war against all, or perhaps it's about worries to do with process and legitimacy, but I wasn't sure which, or maybe something different.
Well, the political project would involve a certain amount of social and economic redistribution, but that is not enough. What is more important, that if the political project should it has to be based upon a political consensus, ideally, that each individual or each fellow citizen is worthy of dignity and is worthy of being recognized as somebody with who deserves dignity and who deserves to be treated with dignity. In fact, coming from a country where people have been disprivileged on account of which group they were born in, I would suggest that the important part is to work among the so-called lower castes and lower classes so that they can actually come into the public domain and make themselves heard. Because political theater is only created when the most dispossessed and the most disprivileged are given an opportunity to speak. And that should be a very important project, because you cannot have a dislink. You cannot delink economic redistribution from social dignity and social equality. In fact, social equality should be at the center of any project of redistribution. Otherwise, we land up with what Harry Frankfurt had called sufficientarianism. How is it important that people are equal? It's more important that they have enough to eat. But poverty is not specifically a matter of being just a frog in the well. It's a question of your relatedness with other people. And if you're going to talk about relational poverty, then you're going to talk about equality. So I think, in a way, equality lies at the center of all our political imaginations and our political projects. So I would assume that any radical political project would be based upon a robust egalitarianism, which would see each individual, let me put it this way, which would see each individual as equally entitled to the collective resources of society. So if anybody has been discriminated against, well, then they lay claim to those resources by virtue of a right, not by virtue of being a victim. If you claim yourself as an equal shareholder, then you approach the system as an equal, not as a victim. That would be my take on a radical political project.
Questions?
Yes. I suppose what I was interested to ask is how...
My problem is I have a hearing problem, so I'll come closer. You tell me.
Transferring of legitimacy for a revolutionary political group within a country to then legitimacy on an international level, and how actors within the international community may view use of political violence as illegitimate, whereas actually within the context of a domestic sphere, it's the most legitimate force that a revolutionary political movement could take.
So it would be a case of internationalism.
Yeah.
Yes, of course, that would be very important. And I think the prime importance, the lesson that has been taught to Maoists, to armed revolutionaries, is a lesson of Nepal, where they actually laid down their gun and joined the constitution-making process. They joined the Constituent Assembly in order to ensure, and I still remember going to Kathmandu and meeting these young women who were hardly 24, 23 years old, and they said, what we are going to put into the constitution, one is we're going to add a third column to male and female, that would be other. And the second innovation that they had thought of is that child will be known by her or his mother's name. Because being a mother is a biological fact, being a father is a matter of faith. That's how they put it. Now, I thought both these innovations in a constitution were of tremendous importance to the feminist movement. And perhaps only the left would have done it, would have thought of these things as being absolutely crucial to the sense of selfhood, to the sense of not being treated as an aberrant or someone else. Unfortunately, it didn't work out because of power politics, and now we have a very standard conservative constitution. But I think in one way, armed insurrection, armed guerrillas in a democratic country, they really don't work because the international links are very difficult to forge. In Latin America, most of the guerrilla wars are about monopolizing resources, particularly cash economy, what was called greed and grievance by that economist, Paul Collier, right? He called it the politics of greed and grievance, where people pick up arms, where groups pick up arms to monopolize claims. A lot of armed struggle goes into self-determination. We see this in the case of Eritrea, for instance, that they fought. And within 2 years, they were back at fighting with Ethiopia after getting their own country. Or in the case of East Timor, which is back into war. A class project for the most disprivileged, because nothing has proved quite as seductive in political terms as nationalism. And nationalism does the most to eradicate class differences and class contradictions. And to say we are a nation, give us our own state, or within a country to say give us our own state within the federation, is the easiest way to paper up these contradictions. Now, in a way, to bring to the fore the question of marginality, the question that, John Rawls once said, a country is best evaluated by its least well-off, by its most deprived. That kind of a perspective, you have to stand political theory on its head and to ask questions that what does it do for people who have been suppressed and continue to be suppressed, and that includes migrants. I don't want to open up another debate here, which requires a very different. But if you look in France, Jean Barberot, their own sociologists, have said that French have forgotten what secularism is about. It used to be about freedom from the clergy. It's now freedom from the aliens. So in a way, you have to think about what concepts which are taken for granted by many are doing to the lives of ordinary people, those people who contribute to the collective resources of a community. We must not forget that originally migrants came into Europe to actually tide over the economic crisis. Now it's gone off into another direction. I think David is better equipped to talk about this than I am. I was only interested in looking up secularism. And in a way, maybe we should think about new forms of citizenship and judge people by the contribution they make to the productive resources of a community, rather than think about religion and their nationality. I don't know. Of course, that raises the question of people who don't do anything, but then we can work out those ways. But as long as we start typing people by their ethnic, what is it called in political theory? What considerations? By considerations that do not matter, then we are going to have this reproduction of violence against people who are seen as the outsiders. But yes, I think we ought to resurrect, your generation maybe can, resurrect the whole notion of internationalism within a left agenda. Let's hope your Labour leader can do it now.
But that wasn't your question, was it? You were talking about the contradictions of legitimacy, as I understood it, between a context which may justify certain kinds of violence in your argument, and a context in international legal arrangements that may see such violence as the illegitimate attack on a sovereign state, for instance.
Yeah, well, that brings... Okay. Sorry, I missed that out. The international legal arrangement which see that such violence legitimate obviously has to be countered. Now, how it will be countered? One suggestion has been that the left in India should start using the social media more, because they're completely absent in public debates and social media. Now, if the left was to come into public debates and see this is a logical outcome of triple disadvantage, you may be able to at least see the welcoming of the welcoming of arms by the national government as illegitimate.
Okay.
But then, multinational corporations sell arms irrespective of the cause. We have to deal with that, yes.
Julian, you have a question.
I'm Julian Rees from the philosophy department here. I wanted to go back to what you started with, and that's the role of the political scientist. And you told us about all these important dilemmas politicians find themselves in, or everybody finds, between democracy and violence, democracy and justice. But I was wondering if the political scientist doesn't, him or herself, also find him or herself in a dilemma, which is between something like sort of being an honest broker, an objective reporter of the facts, a presenter of the evidence, and a political advocate. And there's problems on both sides, right? So you can't be a perfectly honest broker simply because you have to interpret the evidence and you have to, and so on. But you can't just be a political advocate because that undermines your authority as a scientist. So I was wondering how you trade off these sort of things, that dilemma.
Okay. my objective is accept that politics is messy, accept you cannot come to clean conclusions, map out dilemmas, and then take sides, explaining why you have taken a side. Ultimately, taking of a side depends upon your political commitment, your moral commitments, doesn't it? I don't think there can be any such thing as a neutral social scientist, or certainly not in political theory. Now, if you bring both two factors, two faces or three faces or four faces of the same phenomena, lay them open and say these are the problems. Now I think I could have, now if we say for example that revolutionary violence is morally justifiable but politically unwise. So the editor said to me of the publishing house, why didn't you say it's politically unjustified? I said, how can I say when I've just said it's morally justified but politically unwise? That's a fact. It's possible to commit to political violence and yet feel just a bad way of doing politics. Maybe we should think of something else. But that is my perception. You would find people who would say violence, you know, they would reject violence, they would refuse to understand. Even though Gandhi, despite being an advocate of non-violence, actually was a theorist of violence. And his theory was completely contextual. If you see a man with a blazing gun killing school children, somebody puts him out of business would probably do them a favor, isn't it? So it is contextual. In that particular context, it becomes acceptable. It wouldn't be in any other case. Or somebody who pulls back a child from being run over on the road and uses force. Is that justifiable? Within the context, yes. You can't have a defense of violence, as I said, the way we defend civil liberties. But we can certainly think of cases, why is violence necessary? Is it a good way of doing politics? There are other questions that can be asked. I certainly haven't exhausted the list of questions. But that was the point I was trying to make, that you really have to ultimately decide on Aristotelian notion of prudence to decide which is a better case. Your theory might not be neat, but I think the times when political theorists dreamed that they would give neat solutions to the human predicament are long over. I don't think you can give neat solutions to politics, particularly, which is that doesn't rule out thinking through issues. Just thinking through issues thinking through the complexities of an issue rather than by an issue without its complexities or subordinating one to the other. I think the same thing can be said of social movements. You know, in a way, I mean, the loss of the left project and the demise of the class project let loose all these social movements. And the main grievance they had with the left project, and I'm talking about after the fall of the Berlin Wall, when suddenly you have environmental women's movement, race. It starts in the 1960s. But that is a point where the collapse of the class project is mirrored by the emergence of all these movements taking up specific issues and saying the class project did not take them into account. Marxists did not take into account. In one word, it was a good thing. On the other, when you think that here we are facing a totalitarian state or a system of totalitarian states, and our civil societies are so deeply divided, with one refusing to talk to another, how are you going to build up a political consensus? So there are always these sides to a problem. You might think it's important. One would imagine the left would then begin to incorporate everything into the class. They haven't done so. So in a way, that would be my task as a political theorist. I'm not very sure you agree with it.
But it's quite interesting that, Julian, you put the question. I mean, you put a great question, but you put it about a political scientist. Mm-hmm. How would you state it with respect to someone who presents themselves as a political theorist? Precisely someone who reflects systematically on the on normative frameworks.
Yeah.
Would you ask the same question?
No, absolutely, of course.
Okay. Yes, so here you are.
Hello, yeah, my name is Cabral. I'm a PhD student at School of Applied
Yes, tell me.
Sciences.
Can you repeat so that I don't misunderstand your question?
Yeah, my name is Cabral. I'm a student at the School of Applied Social Sciences. I need to admit I do not really have a coherent question for you, rather something that I'm thinking about and I would like to hear your thoughts. it seemed to me that it was important part in your argument or in your reflection that violence might be more justified in regimes which themselves use violence to suppress political opposition. I would like to hear about how should we be thinking about perhaps repressive force within democracy, and especially Western democracy nowadays. And we might say that protest or dissent is often silenced with the use of money, with use of powerful media and publishing houses, and also, let's say, less or more subtle ways of repression which do not rely on excessive violence, such as harassment of activists we saw in France a couple of weeks ago or a week ago, or suppression of peaceful Occupy movement, or use of police agents in order to provoke anarchist movement, let's say, in order to consider illegal ways of actions. So, to sort of conclude, if I will manage, I'm not sure. How do we evaluate this power of money or subtle repression when it comes to how radical should the answer of radical movements be?
Okay, now there are two parts to your question. What is about Gramsci? If you remember Gramsci's selections in the prison notebooks, which actually became available to the English-speaking world only in 1971, with its English translation, he starts off by saying, why is it the revolutions have not happened in advanced capitalist countries, which Marx has theorized, the prime importance being given to Britain, of course. And then he said it's always happened in countries where the states are more are open, are transparent in their authoritarianism. For example, Tsarist Russia. He comes to the conclusion that in democratic countries, revolutions do not happen because civil society is completely permeated by notions of power. So capitalist classes, in tandem with the political classes, reproduce power, which he calls hegemony. It's so subtle and so ingrained, you don't even know what's happening half the time, that you're being cast in a particular mold. The important point is, Gramsci also says, but it is in civil society that you have to have a counter-hegemonic project. If the right to freedom by your democratic governments gives you the power to articulate, then you have to go beyond common sense of ordinary people, because every person is a philosopher in that sense, and build up an argument against these forms. And of course, for that, you need some kind of political consciousness, political sensitivity, political training. So there would be, but I don't think Gramsci thought in notions in terms of a radical armed struggle. Now, armed struggle is very specific to the global South. Of course, you had armed mercenaries in Italy, in various parts of Europe earlier, but that was not quite the same. In the global South, these areas where armed revolutionaries have come up as a major force are areas which are the most deprived, which are outside the pale of capitalism in the sense, let me qualify that, these are areas where the mountain people live, where the lower caste, so-called lower castes live, are very minerally rich, so they are being appropriated, they are being divested of their resources. But for some reason, their voice is not heard. And by voice, I don't mean only the language. You know, the public sphere, civil society has a very definite voice of its own. We have to understand it doesn't take up the cause of the dispossessed, because there is a certain boundary to civil society, and one of those boundaries is violence. You will not use violence within the ramparts of civil society. That would mean that there are enormous numbers of people living outside the beneficence of the state, but also the concern of civil society. And it is precisely here that violence has broken out. That's why I spoke of triple disadvantage. These are obviously people who've not been permeated by Gramsci's notions of hegemony, because nobody has bothered except to treat them like fodder. And if they are being used as fodder for bullets by the Maoists, these are places where little babies actually die of malnutrition, despite all over South Asia. It's not only India. Now, these are areas where you have the highest number of school children dropping out from school, highest unemployment, highest social discrimination. And you ask your representatives of the former left, why don't you take up their concerns? You become parliamentary parties. This is, I think, due to the fact that the parliamentary left has been tamed by the language which has tamed civil society. It is the language of Weberian rationality. It is the language of the bureaucracy. It is not. To give you a very small example before I end, in the west coast of India, there was a major dam being built, which was going to dam the mighty river Narmada, which covered mainly forests. Now, in these forests, most of the people, forest dwellers, don't have legal title to land. So initially, when they were started being moved out, and then social activists came in and started talking about compensation. And a revenue official comes to one of these tribals and asks him, where is your land? And he says, this is my land. And he says, where is your legal deed? He said, I don't have a legal title. How do you know this is your land? The bones of my ancestors are buried there. Now, if you read anthropology, bones of ancestors covering large places of land are very much a part of a tribal way, a pre-primitive, sorry to use these words, of tribal ways of life, pre-property. It's only when social activists take up this whole issue of giving land to them. But you see, you have two languages which your bureaucrat is unable to comprehend. It is the language of ownership of land. It is the language of common ownership of land. So these are people which are outside Max Weber's bureaucratic rationality. And it is precisely here that armed struggle has broken out. It should show up the fault lines. In a way, it should show up the fault lines in your democracy. That it doesn't is a comment on democracy. I don't know why more work is not being done on democracy and violence, because it's such an integral part of democracy. But that is it. So Gramsci's notion of hegemony doesn't really function. They probably show up the fault lines in that theory of hegemony as well.
2 or 3 more questions before we stop. Have I got any else there?
Oh, can I talk again?
You can.
That's awesome. I encourage everyone else to have a go, though. I think it's all really very interesting and really exciting, but I'm slightly worried, and this is my worry. I'm worried that the things that you are saying could be used by people who have very right-wing conceptions about what justice is to justify all sorts of things, to justify rule by bureaucrats or experts, to justify military intervention. And I'm worried that these questions of what justice requires are so disputed. Do we need some sort of process? Do we need to say, it's not enough to say, I'm doing this violence in the name of justice? Do I also need to say, I have some sort of process through which I am legitimately representing the interests of people the way that they themselves voice them? So do you need something a bit like democracy, but some sort of real democracy in order to justify it?
Can we hold that? Can you manage 2 or 3 questions?
Quickly. My notion of justification has very little relationship with justice, okay? Justification is moral defense, okay? It's justifiable. Justice is very clearly that no one should be burdened with should be shouldered with more of the burden than anybody else in society, and everyone should have the equal benefit. Now, if a certain section of your population has been left out of this ambit of justice, which is not always realized by a democracy, though I would think it flows from the presuppositions of democracy, but just for the sake of argument, justice is somehow, democracies are imperfect because they leave justice unfulfilled. Now, my case is, understand why they've picked up the gun. That may be a justifiable reason, but doesn't mean it's politically wise. You say, is it prima facie? I mean, prima facie, yes, I would look at it. And prima facie, I think most cases would allow for violence. I don't abide by structural violence. I mean, I don't like Galtung's notion of structural violence. But I am talking about the violence that is heaped upon a group of people with active connivance. So I would completely part of that liberal notion of justice as equal share in benefits and burdens of a society. Yeah.
One last question.
Hi, I'm Robin from the philosophy department. I've got two questions, one which kind of follows on from Beth's thing, which is how, because you said that the most important thing is to make sure that the people that are revolting are politicised, and how do you ensure their education is pursuing justice rather than just being radicalised for another endeavour?
I'm sorry, David, can you, but it has to do with my problem, yeah.
Yes. Do you want to just say it slightly more forcefully?
How does one ensure that they are politicising? As in louder?
No, as in louder, yes, probably.
How do you ensure that you're politicising the people in the right way?
Okay.
So how is it that they're not being radicalised, but they are being politicised?
Okay.
And the other question I wanted to pose is something that follows on from what you mentioned when you were talking to Julian, and you mentioned Aristotle, and I wonder if this idea that there's this tug of war going on between democracy and violence is because we've categorised the idea that democracy is good, violence is bad, whereas instead we could go on a sort of more virtue ethic approach and say that, again, with prudence, democracy can often be a good and often does ensure it's the most likely system to ensure people are protected, and violence is often not a good thing, but it's not the same as saying categorically one's bad and one's good. Could we not get rid of the division of the two just by approaching it from a different framework, like an Aristotelian one?
Okay, well, the answer to the first question is actually all modes of politics are supposed to bring a certain degree of political consciousness to the people, isn't it? Give them choices. And I would say, ideally, revolutionaries should not be imposing their ideology upon the people. They should be giving them choices. You know, this is an alternative ways of getting things done. The problem is you're also not very sure whether the revolutionaries are also the people who are most affected. Very often the two are different. One is moved ideologically, the other is moved by getting enough land to feed his family. There are all these discrepancies in violence which make it a very, very dicey concept to fight protest with. And this is what I have tried to kind of in a larger way show that, look, what are they doing ultimately? They're not doing anything that communist parties are not doing, or at least putting on their platform. So if all that is, this is what they are doing, if their violence is not being yoked to a political project or a political project that replicates mainstream political agenda, sorry, we don't need that kind of revolutionary. It's not revolutionary. It's violence as theater. It's nothing more. You make subjects of people. So how do we know that the right kind of politics? I would imagine you might bring political judgment to bear about what kind of politics. Politics is not only about electing people or representation, it's about representing the most marginalized, isn't it? I would imagine. Your second question is a little more complicated. How would you negotiate it?
Well, I would just say that there isn't necessarily an incompatibility.
The democracy and justice part of it, yes.
Yeah, I don't really see there being an inconsistency with there being democracy and violence. Because if you're a true democracy, you're essentially a republic, you serve the people, sort of thing. And if violence is what's required for the people, then the democratic, the republican thing to do is to impose violence to ensure the best outcomes for the people. So in that sense, as I say, using sort of Aristotelian sort of framework, you turn around and say, it's just for me to do this terrible thing right now. Categorically, I might say it's a bad act, but I still say it's the right act.
Yes. But don't you see democracy as a project, always in the making? Where do you see a finished democracy?
You don't. That's why I said that means that violence will always have to be part of a democracy, and I don't see why that would have to necessarily mean a...
There are certain presumptions of democracy which are given in the basic axiom of one person, one vote. Now, there's a whole theory of equality that can be brought out, worked out from this basic axiom. Unfortunately, people are quite happy to go and vote and then go into their lives. It's research after research has shown political passiveness of voters. Where is justice in this? And you have to relate justice to democracy concretely through theoretical intervention. I don't see many liberal political philosophers doing it. They prefer to see it as two different areas. They just assume that the context of justice is a democracy. Every authoritarian ruler justifies, he talks in the name of some justice, or maybe justice of a holy book, but there is justice in what they're doing. Now, in a way, I think the potential of democracy has to be worked out through collective action. But for people for whom not even collective action is an option, maybe violence is. I mean, it is one of the possibilities of politics. But we also have to be careful to see what forms of violence we defend. I wouldn't defend secessionism, for instance, except in very, very specific circumstances. I think it's a lazy way out because you eschew moral obligation to your fellow citizens when you secede. Right? You just say, we don't care what kind of a rotten society you have, just give us a state of our own. So it's very indefensible.
But that assumes that historically contingent borders created by force have some kind of legitimacy. I just don't see that argument.
Yes.
It may well be that secession, under some circumstances, creates
under
a
colonialism,
more bounded political community than those boundaries created by colonial powers and empires.
Yes,
what
true.
we see in the Middle East now is the collapse of borders, but created by Western colonial powers, because those borders no longer reflect, and actually never did reflect, the complex ethnicities and identities in many of those countries.
True. There are specific cases, and of course I'm leaving apart colonial contexts. But in context, I think the challenge is to have different people belonging to different creeds and speaking different languages, living together in the same territory. Because history tells us that a separate state has not really solved any issue. It has created issues in turn. So within the issue is democracy and justice. The issue is not a separate territorial state. It doesn't resolve any issue, by the fact of it. But yes, we can, of course, have a longish debate on the issues you've raised.
Like I say, it might solve very important cultural and symbolic issues. Take the Scots, for example. Albeit at the last referendum, there was a majority to stay in Scotland. The issues around Catalonia, Scotland, and many other instances besides, it's not a distributional struggle. I mean, it can be partly perceived as a distributional struggle in relation to a centre, London or Madrid, let's say, but actually what's going on is a much more complex struggle for a kind of cultural and symbolic identity that has meaning, has significance.
Absolutely.
So,
the difference is, David, that in these cases, they're willing to abide by the decision of the Canadian High Court in the case of Quebec, that have a referendum, abide by certain liberal principles, and then at least begin to talk. But in many cases of secession in the global South, there are armed struggles. And actually a lot of extraneous issues have come. Now, I can sympathize with the Kashmiri cause because I think Indian government has been unjust to Kashmir. But why would I sympathize with causes of mercenaries who talk of a different issue altogether, a theologically inspired state? I don't say it's my duty. So I don't know, I've started feeling you have to really think through each issue as it arises. There are no formulas for political...
Oh, well, on that note, I think everyone in the room would probably agree, including you. So, on that note, let me thank you all very, very much for coming. You've come a long way, especially for you're leaving tomorrow at 5 o'clock.
Very early, yes.
I think that is more than any duty would require.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming.